Okay, we should now be recording. This is great. Everybody who's not joining live can watch it, as well as students in my future pedology classes. I may be presenting to this.
No pressure or anything, right?
Thank you so much for joining us, Megan, PhD student, PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota studying Gelisols. Can tell us everything you need to know. Take it
Yeah.
away, Megan.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm very excited to be here and thank you for the invite. I know of other people who would be much more qualified to give this little lecture, but I'm glad it can be me because I would never turn down an opportunity to nerd out about Gelisols. I'm also very excited that this is the first soil order you guys are talking about. Everybody usually leaves it for last, and it does not deserve to be last, in my biased opinion. So I was making these slides for this presentation and realized that it was exactly like almost to the date. It was 5 years ago that I was sitting in a very similar class to what you guys are in right now. And I was learning about gelisols for the first time and their classification and taxonomy. And I thought it was really cool. And they were really interesting soils, but they also seemed like so out of reach, right? And in, having a goal of seeing all 12 soil orders, I was like, oh, for sure, gelisols are going to be the last ones I check off if I ever see them, right? And I guess the moral of the story there is never say never, because now here we are, like 5 years later. And let me see if I can get there it goes. All right. So like Paul said, I am now a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota. I am a pedologist by training, but my specialty is in permafrost affected soils. So my research is kind of focused on how permafrost formation affects soil development and just kind of broadly like why these soils look the way that they do, and what that can tell us about permafrost history and maybe future changes. So let's see, without further ado, these are the things that I would kind of like to touch on today. We'll go through the basics. What are gelisols? We'll go through suborders and horizonation, a little bit of field logistics, because I'm able to share some personal experiences there. I also want to talk about different like soil formation factors, and also disturbance and the global significance of gelisols. This might be a little bit to get through in time. I'm going to try to do it in about 40 minutes. That being said, if anything catches your eye, if you have questions, anything, feel free to stop me. I can kind of see you guys in the classroom, so feel free to raise your hand or interrupt me or something. Very willing to delve deeper into any one topic, because this is a very broad overview and there's so much more interesting things to talk about, and I would love to do that. So just keep that in mind. And without further ado, what are gelisols? So gelisols are soils that have permafrost within 1 meter of the surface, or they have permafrost within 2 meters of the soil surface and gelic materials within that first meter. And gelic materials are any evidence of cryoturbation or ice segregation, basically evidence that the soil was at one point frozen, permafrost, and it is no longer frozen, but the evidence is still there. So general gist is permafrost within 1 meter or 2. So what is permafrost? A lot of people don't know this, but permafrost is actually technically a thermal state, and it's not associated with any specific material. The most common example is soil, and so that's what we commonly associate it with, but it doesn't have to be. Another little fun fact, that's why we say that permafrost thaws and not melts, because with permafrost, it's not like a change in phase state. It's not like going from ice to liquid water. That would be melting. So the ice within the permafrost melts, but the soil itself is always in a solid phase. So permafrost thaws, it doesn't melt. But permafrost, by definition, is any material that remains frozen for 2 consecutive years. So for our soils, it means that the soil has to remain frozen for like basically through 1 growing season. And this might have you thinking, like, that doesn't seem like a very long time for something that is supposed to be semi-permanent, right? And you would be totally correct. So we actually have different layers of permafrost that we describe. And these layers are distinguished based on the time that the soil was last thawed. So going top down in this diagram, can you all see my mouse?
Yes.
Sweet. Okay. So this top layer up here is the active layer. And this layer thaws every single summer or growing season. So this layer is technically not permafrost. Just below the active layer, we have the transition zone. And this is the zone of permafrost that has thawed basically at different time scales. So the transient layer is usually close to the surface of the permafrost table. The transient layer thaws at kind of like decadal time scales. So in Alaska, our transient layers usually thawed sometime in the last 100 years. And then below that, you have the intermediate layer. And that layer of permafrost is usually thawed in the last millennia. The ranges vary a lot. There's different morphological properties of the soil that you can use to identify these layers. But it's important to make these distinctions to actually know how dynamic permafrost is. And then below that, we have our true permafrost, or permafrost that is, in theory, never thawed since it originally formed, which is pretty crazy to think about. From a soil perspective, when we're only looking at the top 2 meters of permafrost, a lot of times we never even get into the true permafrost because it's usually pretty deep. But that should just give you a general idea of, it sounds like these soils are permanently frozen because of the term permafrost, but they're actually very dynamic and constantly changing. Okay, so you're also going to hear me refer to these soils as permafrost affected soils more often than gelisols. And that is because not all permafrost affected soils actually classify as gelisols. We talked about for gelisols, like the permafrost has to be within the top 2 meters. And sometimes that's just not the case. Sometimes it's a lot farther down, but it still has huge implications for land use and ecosystem dynamics. So it's important to consider this in all soils. And in the case that they don't classify as gelisols, they usually either classify as entosols or histosols, depending on the organic layer content. So that's why I tend to use permafrost affected soils versus gelisols. But for the rest of this presentation, I will be showing you photos of gelisols. Okay, so moving into different suborders and horizonation. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this meme, but it's one of my personal favorites. And I hope that Paul doesn't give you tests like this.
I don't know how the first one go.
So on the left, you have, a more stereotypical permafrost, or not permafrost, but soil profile. And then on the right, you have a gelisol with these crazy horizonations. So the first suborder that keys out for gelisols are histels. And histels are characterized by high organic matter content. They have to have more than 50 centimeters of organic material at the surface. And we're saying that these descriptions are kind of a general overview, but these are how the soils usually fall out. So they have to have more than 50 centimeters of organics. Those organic horizons can be OIs, OEs, OAs. It could be a combination of all three. It could be one of them. This pit here was actually solid OI horizons. It classifies as a fibrostel. And it was extremely hard to dig. This was from the Yukon Territory in Canada, right outside of Beaver Creek, which is just over the border from Alaska. This pit was so hard to dig that we literally couldn't put a shovel through it. And so myself and fellow grad student Irf here, we had to dig this entire pit with 2 serrated bread knives. And it took multiple hours. But it was very interesting, probably one of the most interesting pits I've ever had to dig. But just really, really thick peat accumulation. Here's another example of a histel. This one is up on the north slope of Alaska. I was gonna show you for future reference because I'm gonna reference it a lot. On this map here, this is the Brooks Range right here. And this whole area above or north of the Brooks Range is the north slope of Alaska. So I refer to that a lot. And most of the North Slope pits that I will show you are from like right in this area usually. So just for future reference. But this is where this pit is from. And this histel has so much organic material, right? You can see your OI horizons, your OEs, your OAs, and just really, really thick organics. So much more than the 50 centimeters required. But a histel is a histel, even if it has, 51 centimeters of organics at the surface. All right, our second suborder are turbels. And turbels have less than 50 centimeters of organics at the surface, and they have to have evidence of cryoturbation. And cryoturbation is when we describe soils with JJ suffixes. So like this BGJJ, AJJ, all of this material down here has kind of been frost churned down deeper into the soil profile. Turbels make up a lot of the Gelisols in Alaska. So this phenomenon of cryoturbation is extremely common in these soils. And I remember from my first Gelisol lecture, I was like, cryoturbation sounds crazy cool. I have literally no concept of what actually happens. So I'm going to try to give you all a general idea of what exactly is cryoturbation, because it's a really cool phenomenon that basically only happens in Gelisols. So cryoturbation generally is the subduction of organic material under mineral material due to preferential thawing. So if you take this pit, for example, you notice that this entire section is comprised of mostly mineral material, whereas over here, it's pretty solid organics. And what I've drawn here is this dashed line is the depth to frozen at the time of sampling. And what you notice is that in the mineral material, your thaw depth is a lot deeper than it is in the organics. And that's because the organics act as really good insulators for permafrost. So in the summertime, the mineral material will thaw deeper, while the organics will thaw shallower. But it also works in reverse. So late fall and early winter, the mineral soil freezes back up a whole lot faster than the organics. And what that means is that all of the water within the soil pores in this profile kind of start moving towards the freezing front, right? So the mineral soil is freezing faster than the organics. So basically, a lot of the water in the organic material gets pulled into the mineral. And then you have basically like oversaturation of these mineral soil pores. And when liquid water turns into ice and freezes, it expands by like 9%. So then all of a sudden you have this massive expansion of your mineral material. And the only way for the soil to expand is up. So you get this huge upheaval of these little mineral domes. And then what happens at the top is it's unstable and kind of gets heavy. So that mineral material then kind of slumps over onto the surrounding organics. And so you have the mineral material that's more dense, it's heavier, it falls on top of the organics and kind of starts to like churn those organics down further into the profile. And as this happens year after year after year, your organics get even farther down in your profile and you get even crazier horizonations. So there's many, many ways that cryoturbation can look, basically. Both of these pits are still from the North Slope of Alaska. So very, very similar climates and everything like that. In this pit on the left, you can see that there's basically a huge mineral layer. And then you have the organics buried way down at the bottom. And these organics most likely came from the surface somewhere far off screen, right, of this picture. And so sometimes it's just crazy to me how to comprehend how much time it takes for these organics to get this far down into a soil profile just by cryoturbation. So it's a very fair assumption to say that these organics down here are thousands of years old, which to me is just mind-blowing. And I think it's so cool, but obviously I'm a little biased. This pit on the right here is interesting because you have this whole cryoturbated horizon that was probably, originally brought down from the surface in a similar way to, what the pit on the left looks like. But in this horizon, you can see all these different, streaks of organics and mineral soil mixed. And what's happening with this one is the cryoturbation is not only happening with like the profile as a whole, but it's also happening at a smaller scale within the profile. So all of these areas are being churned kind of at a micro scale, if you will. So it happens in a lot of different ways. Okay, enough about cryoturbation. We have one more suborder to go through, and that is orthels. Now, orthels don't have the really thick organic layers like the histels do. They don't have any crazy cryoturbated horizons. So these are just the other gelisols. You still have permafrost within a meter, and otherwise, not much else going on in these soils. And they don't comprise a whole lot of gelisols in Alaska, only about 6%. And a lot of that is because of the soil formation and permafrost formation in those soils. So this gelisol, I helped dig in the Copper River Basin here in kind of like south central Alaska. I will talk more about the Copper River Basin in a little bit, but basically the soil formation here allowed these soils to freeze really quickly, and there wasn't a whole lot of time for cryoturbation to occur before it was vegetated, and it's remained pretty stable since then. So kind of interesting. Okay, moving on to a little bit of field logistics, because digging permafrost pits is very unlike digging in any other soil that I've ever been in. All of the pits that I've shown you thus far are pits that, we shovel out any unfrozen material like you would do normally, but then to get through frozen layers, we actually have to use jackhammers in a pit this big. And lugging jackhammers across the tundra is quite a feat. And so it's not something we actually do very often. But it's really cool to see these different pit pictures. So the first thing we do when we start these pits is to remove the active layer. And usually that consists of removing the organic layer first. I mentioned when we were talking about cryoturbation that the organics are a very important insulating layer for permafrost. And so we take the utmost of care to preserve this insulation layer. We cut them apart in square blocks and we move them over to a tarp somewhere nearby. And then basically just like a puzzle, we put it back exactly where we found it after we filled in the rest of the pit. So very, very important to conserve this layer. After the organics are gone, then we start taking out the mineral, or the unfrozen mineral stuff. And I think something worth mentioning here is the presence of tarps that we have hanging in the trees. It's very important for us to use tarps as shade for these pits because as soon as you expose that permafrost, it starts thawing immediately. And not only is it a sloppy mess, it's also not good for the future of permafrost at that site. So we try to minimize disturbance in as many ways as possible. So once we get down to our frozen boundary, what we normally do instead of using jackhammers is we use what we call a SIPRI auger. And SIPRI stands for Snow, Ice, Permafrost Research Equipment. Very generic. I think it was developed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and basically primarily used for permafrost research today. It functions in a very similar way to an ice auger. And it can be run by either a gas-powered auger head or even a drill. I have a little video for you here, and I hope it plays for you well in real time. But basically, you drill down and you pull out your little auger, and within that auger, you will have a little permafrost core. This video is from that Histel pit from the Yukon Territory that I was showing you guys earlier. But more common than not, we actually only take like a small little plug out from the active layer, put it on a tarp, and then drill right down from there. So this process is what we normally do besides digging huge pits everywhere. Another thing I like to note, this picture on the far left makes me laugh because you can see the guy laying back there on the tundra. That is our bear guard. And he's doing a fabulous job, but he's also very intrigued by what we're doing with this auger. That picture was taken in Manitoba near Churchill, Canada on the Hudson Bay. And they've got a lot of polar bears out there. So we are not allowed to go out and do field work without a bear guard, which makes life interesting. Okay, there's the video again. So the cores come out of the auger, and then we put them in gutters, and that's how we make our soil descriptions. The auger can go through just about any material except for rock, basically. So, and the diversity of the cores that we see is absolutely amazing. And a lot of my research is focused on the different characteristics of these cores and describing ice structures and redox features within the cores. When these cores come out of the ground, they immediately start to thaw. So our description and sampling process is kind of like a race against time. We do whatever descriptions we have to in the field, like with color and texture. and anything that we actually have to do in, real time. And then we focus on taking really, really good pictures. And I actually finished the descriptions for all these soils based off of pictures after we've left the field. And then for sampling, I literally take a hammer and a butcher knife and cut up the core and take those samples frozen back to the lab for any analysis that we do on them. Okay, so a little bit about the actual soils behind the permafrost. Because I think it's important to remember that, like, yes, these soils are frozen, but they also have the same formation factors that any other soils have. So here I want to take you through 3 different geographical areas of Alaska. And I've been in all of these places. And so the first one that we'll look at is the Arctic foothills, and then we'll go to the Copper River Basin, and then the Yukon-Kuskokwim River Delta. Okay, so starting in the Arctic foothills. So the permafrost up here is climate driven, meaning that it's still very cold up here on the North Slope, and the climate actually promotes permafrost formation. The permafrost is also continuous, meaning that basically no matter where you dig, you will hit permafrost at some depth. The soils here are forming in glacial till that came out of the Brooks Range during the last glacial maximum, approximately 10,000 years ago. What I think is interesting is, so the age of this till is actually really similar to the younger glaciation events that we had in the lower 48. So it's interesting to think of these soils as the same age. But since the soils up here are frozen, they show a lot less development in the profiles. And the vegetation up here is literally just tundra. It's too far north to have any sort of trees. So tundra for as far as you can see. Okay, then we have the Copper River Basin. And the permafrost here is considered ecosystem protected because the climate is no longer cold enough to actually promote permafrost formation. So at one point, the climate was cold enough, the permafrost formed, and then now we have this massive boreal forest on top of the permafrost that is actually protecting it and acting as insulation for the permafrost to actually keep it there. The unfortunate thing is if this forest ever burns, we will likely lose the near surface permafrost directly below it. And it's not impossible, but there's a very slim chance that the permafrost would ever aggrade back towards the surface. The permafrost here is considered discontinuous. But a lot of studies suggest that within the basin here, the permafrost is pretty nearly continuous. I think I mentioned earlier that this basin is formed in glacial-lacustrine sediments because it's the site of a proglacial lake known as Lake Atna. This lake was around during the Pleistocene and then finally drained kind of in the early Holocene. And then that's when these soils started developing and when the permafrost formed. So these soils are about the same age as those on the North Slope, which is interesting. And that pit picture there at the bottom is the same ortho that I was showing you earlier. Okay, and finally, we have the YK River Delta. So this permafrost is also considered ecosystem protected, just like the Copper River Basin. It's also discontinuous permafrost, but it's honestly probably more like a sporadic permafrost zone because you only find the permafrost on the tundra uplands when you get like further away from the rivers. This is one of the largest river deltas in the world. The river and drainage networks are very extensive. And when the rivers move, they basically expose the riverbanks and the permafrost thaws. So the permafrost just keeps getting farther and farther from the riverbanks. These soils are very typical floodplain soils. They're very sandy, which actually makes the permafrost more susceptible to thaw, because sandier soils will thaw faster than soils that have, majority silt or clay contents. The vegetation here is pretty diverse, but like I said, the permafrost is basically only found on the tundra, because those organic layers are providing insulation for it. And then this pit picture, actually it's not a pit, it's a river exposure. Just wanted to note that it's not technically a gelisol because there was no permafrost, but it's a really cool floodplain soil on the banks of the Kuskokwim River. Okay, so now moving into one of our last talking points here, talking about disturbance and global significance of gelisols. Because when we talk about gelisols, like one of the things that comes up is it supports the smallest population of people compared to any of the other soil orders. And, while that's true, I do think there's a lot to be said about the significance of gelisols and their preservation for the world, right? So just because it's a long ways away from us doesn't mean that what happens up there doesn't affect us. Gelisols contain anywhere from 30 to 50% of the global soil carbon stocks. And just that number is much more carbon than what's currently in our atmosphere. So we definitely have a right to be concerned that if this carbon is mobilized again, it's got to go somewhere. And there's a lot of really cool research happening about, the different transitions that are happening in permafrost systems, and where carbon is going first and in what form. A lot of really cool things going on. But we should definitely be concerned about keeping this carbon reservoir intact, and what's going to happen in our future. One example, a very common example of permafrost disturbance, is the formation of thermokarst. A thermokarst literally means, like changes in topography due to heat. So thermokarst can be formed by natural means in these permafrost systems, but predominantly nowadays, there's some sort of anthropogenic forcing that causes these pits to open up. And they happen all across the Arctic to, varying degrees, varying, some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller. This thermokarst pit was near Beaver Creek in the Yukon Territory. And I think it's worth having the people for scale in the pit. And we don't know exactly how it formed. We have our theories, but it seems to be forming in a very unique spot, and it seems to have formed very fast. The good news is that it has since stabilized, but we also don't know why it stabilized. So just, another reason to try to understand these ecosystems more, and how these soils might change in the future. Another quick example that I have is, again, from the North Slope of Alaska. We were up there in July of 2023, and in early July of that year, they had one day where they had like a record rainfall event. And then all of a sudden they had flooding everywhere and some serious erosion and thermokarst formation. And this picture on the left here is just a couple weeks after that rain event and the formation of this gully. There was no drainage way in this area, you know, the day before this rain event. So this was all caused by flooding. We were able to go back about a year later. We were there in June of this year. And, you know, still doesn't look great, but it's interesting because you can see like the gully itself has kind of infilled with sediment, most likely from thawing permafrost kind of, you know, upstream of this, for lack of a better term. The cool part is the next pictures I'm going to show you are of right under here in this picture. And so when we saw this formation in 2023, we found a lot of ice wedges that were all of a sudden exposed in the permafrost. So you can see under this bank here, you have a little ice wedge. The cool part is that, well, kind of cool, is this year the bank had slumped over so much that it's protecting the permafrost behind it. So these formations usually have, there's a natural way of stabilizing themselves, basically. So it's not always a positive feedback loop when thermokarst forms. Unfortunately, it tends to be, unless you're able to develop some sort of conditions that protect the permafrost behind these exposures. Yeah. Okay. So to close out here, I've got 3 little takeaways for you that if you take nothing else from this presentation, I want it to be this. A lot of people think of permafrost and gelisols, and they think of one vast frozen wasteland. And these soils are, they're not that at all, right? They're forests, they're floodplains, and there's tundras. And people have lived here for thousands of years, right? And we might just think of these soils as a carbon reservoir, but these landscapes are someone's home, right? Entire cultures have been founded on their existence. And that is something that we should never forget, regardless if we're doing research up there on these soils or not. There we go. There's a second one. Okay. Second, these soils are so cool because they've literally been frozen in time, right? When we look at these soils, we're getting a glimpse at what the soil and world might have looked like thousands of years ago. So that's really cool, but we also have to keep in mind that these soils are still very dynamic. They change and have unique morphological properties, just like any other soil. It's just that change kind of happens at much different time scales. Okay, and finally, I think, you know, this can be said for a lot of different soils, but permafrost affected soils, they're all different and they all have their own unique story. But a lot of times I see that story as a story of perseverance, right? And it's crazy to consider everything that these soils have been through and the fact that us as humans can so drastically change these soils just in our short lifetimes, right? And so with my research, I love telling the stories of these soils. And after today, I hope that you all can join me in that goal. So that's all I had. Do you all have any questions for me?
That's beautiful. Thank you, Megan.
Of course.
We've got plenty of time. I've got 43 right now. We're here until 50. So Riley, wanna
So how do you measure when a thermokarst is stabilized?
Well, basically, with that specific pit in the Yukon, we've gone back to that site a couple years, 3 years in a row now. And we use drones to actually fly over the pit. And it's visual observation. And we've noticed that since that first year when we found it, every year since it hasn't gotten bigger, basically. So that's a good thing. If we wanted to, it was actually quite a trek to get to this pit, which is why we used the drone. If it had gotten bigger, we probably would have gone back in there and taken some measurements and see if anything else had thawed. But generally, we can also measure like land subsidence by satellite imagery, and radar and that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of permafrost subsidence folks that do that research. So that's really interesting because we can see fluctuations, just by mere centimeters of if the ground is settling or not, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Kinda, I was just curious because I know that one of the things that's kind of new is like drones taking thermal imagery. Have you ever
Yes.
considered using like drone thermal imagery to see like soil temperature of the thermal
Yes.
part to see the difference?
Yeah. Well, I personally haven't used it for any of these thermokarst pits that we've had. But I know of people who do it. It's really cool. And actually another interesting part with that, besides temperature, is actually measuring carbon and methane emissions from these pits, because you can actually pick up tracers from right around the area where the pit develops. And there's huge spikes in carbon and methane emissions from those points. Yeah. Good questions.
Megan, I've got one for you.
Yeah.
Puts me now. I've talked a lot to my students about the FOMO that I live with, calling myself a soil scientist, never having been to Alaska before. So I'm really thrilled to bring you out here on this, but I understand there's a lot of challenges associated with doing field work in Alaska.
Yeah.
You mentioned the jackhammers and stuff. I can't imagine forgetting anything, leaving anything behind, but just when we're talking about logistics and living while doing this field work, what's worse, the insects or the permanent daylight?
Insects, without a doubt. I think after digging these pits every day, it doesn't matter if it's full daylight out, I sleep like a baby. I think the 24 hours of daylight is really interesting. We don't have it everywhere in Alaska we go, but we definitely have it in the North Slope when we're there in July, like late June, early July. It's really interesting, but it also makes for a really long field day. You can get a lot done. But yeah, no, the bugs, the mosquitoes, the black flies, the no-see-ums, they can be absolutely miserable. So I don't know if, I think it's in my little intro slide for me, we have bug shirts that we literally look like beekeepers, but we zip completely up, and that shirt is probably my best investment ever. It keeps me sane.
Anybody else with a Gelisol question? If not, I think that'll do it for us. Thank you so much, Megan. Wonderful photos, wonderful real life, experience with these. I feel like Gelisol description, it really seems like the Wild West. It's a frontier, you know. I talk about what's new in the field of pedology, what's the future, what are pedology professors breaking new ground on. And I mean, I mentioned digital soil mapping, urban soil mapping, and it's Gelisols.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and it's crazy, you know, because with that point, Paul, like we are working on publishing manuscripts right now of how to describe and sample these soils, because there's a very small amount of people who know how to do it and do it well and minimize disturbance. And that's extremely important if more and more people get interested in these soils and want to do research in them. So yeah, that's actually something that we're working on now, is just how to, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, hard to imagine really any kind of soil that's um, more relevant. Like think about global importance, thinking about climate change, carbon cycling, all kinds of research that people outside of soil science are doing, and all the assumptions, all the models of all the
Yeah.
carbon on terrestrial land, and
Yeah,
that's where a lot of it's locked up. So
totally. And you know, and a lot of people are concerned, you know, and there's good reason to be concerned. But there's also a lot of models that show that, you know, there might actually still be a lot of carbon that remains sequestered, even though the permafrost thaws. So I think there is a message of hope, and I don't think that that gets portrayed nearly enough. So while we should be concerned, we should not be, we should still be optimistic, put it that way.
great note to end on, and we're very glad to hear from you, Meg. So thank you so much once again,
Oh yeah, thank you so much for having me.
and that'll do it for us.
Cool. Have a